gosh, we've got a really cram-packed group today, which I think is probably in response to a very timely matter that is today's program. We are on the cusp of updating the comprehensive plans in our communities. Bellingham's, of course, Whatcom County's, and there's a handout. I'm not going to distract you with that now, but at your table there's a takeaway handout from the county, which is very helpful in knowing how they're going to be handling this as well. And all the communities in Whatcom County also have to update theirs. The reason it's timely is that the legislature decided, in looking around at the state, that we are still desperately in need of housing at all affordability levels for people who are coming to or trying to get by here, frankly, be it with rentals or single-family homes. And they have said each local government must address the growth that is coming. So it's not a question. And I know some here would prefer that there be no further growth, but the reality is, between climate escapism and the wonderful attractiveness of our area, that definitely we're going to be seeing more people coming. And we just can't afford, the state legislature said, no, but we just cannot afford to go without meeting the demand for housing much more adequately than we have in recent years. And so we have invited a panel to come together to help inform us about these matters and the balancing act that we'll be facing in terms of meeting housing demand. Now, I might say that one of the great things about today is we're going to consider both the challenges, but also the opportunities. I mean, this is really a special time for us because we are all, to the extent we become involved, we're going to help shape the future of our communities for decades to come. So this is an important topic for us. And as a result, we have three very good panelists who I think will help us understand a lot about this topic. So I'm going to start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll take off from there so that they can provide their comments. And I do want to mention that at the close of their presentations, we will be opening the floor to questions from the audience. And I just want to, because of the challenge of this particular topic and what we're really going to be wrestling with for a while here in our county, we really are looking for questions from the audience, not statements. And therefore, those who carry the traveling mic to give you an opportunity may well hold on to it and jerk it away from your lips if you get carried away with statements versus questions. But with that, let's introduce the panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce Garrett O'Brien. Garrett is the owner and president of Volanta Corporation, which is a firm that has been and continues to design and build both single-family and multifamily housing, not only in Bellingham and Whatcom County, but throughout Northwest Washington. Now, Garrett is a former planning commissioner, so he's been down that road. He's also been he is a former board member of the Building Industry Association of Whatcom County, and has also been on the city's review board that looks at applications for funding from the Home Fund, which provides money to help with housing. And so he's had a chance to look at those things. He's also often invited to participate in meetings of the Housing Alliance of Whatcom, the Whatcom Housing Alliance, which is sort of an informal group of people who are local government people, planners, people in the construction industry, and other professionals who focus on the questions of housing demand, supply, and policy. So he brings a lot of insights, I think, with him. Garrett received his Bachelor in Science degree in in construction management from Central Washington University. So Garrett, I'm just introducing now everybody before you even get started. Secondly, we have Blake Lynch. I'm sorry. Who has been the Planning and Community Development Director here since March of 2022. Right. And he came already well armed to help us with this kind of thing because prior to coming to Bellingham, he had over 20 years of significant and broad experience with local governments in terms of zoning, planning, and dealing with the development of communities. In fact, and this was mostly in Florida and California, those 20 plus years. However, when he was in Redwood City, California, he was responsible for the redevelopment of the downtown, as well as implementing Redwood City's comprehensive plans. So he knows whereof he speaks, and I think that's going to be incredibly valuable to us. He has a bachelor's degree from Principia College in environmental science, and also a master's degree from, help me with the name again, once again.
Notre Dame de Namur.
Right. Notre Dame de Namur, which is a university in San Mateo, California. And our third panelist, it has some really great talents to help us with, particularly in the illustration of a number of things. He is Chris Behe, who was originally a county planner here, and then was hired by the city of Bellingham as its GPS analyst, and then also now is the division manager for planning in the city. He has a great understanding of the urban growth area, the neighborhoods of Bellingham and their densities. He's looked a lot into the housing supply and demand and its challenges here, and at how we could best address the gap that has developed over the years. He earned a bachelor's degree from Western Washington University, so he's definitely a local product in terms of his education. So these are our three panelists. I'm looking forward, as I'm sure we all are, to hearing from them about what we are doing as we update the comp plan and deal with this housing dilemma that we face. And so I'm going to reintroduce Garrett O'Brien to start us off. Garrett.
Okay, I think it's on now. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for the introduction. Today's topic of my presentation is land use policy, buildable lands, and the housing crisis. I use the title Bellingham's Housing Puzzle because I think a complicated puzzle is a good metaphor for the interlocking connections that housing has with a lot of other social policies that we consider, whether we're talking about, the character of our neighborhoods, promoting open space and protecting open space, economic development, and our resource conservation. Housing's at the center and connected to all of it. For our purposes today, I'd like to explore with you three pieces of the housing puzzle. Understanding factors beyond Bellingham that impact our housing, our local land use policy and its impacts on our buildable lands, and how to meet our future challenges. Next slide, please. I'm going to move through these next slides fairly quickly, because later in the presentation I want to spend a little bit more time on a few of the topics. So please bear with me if I'm going quickly, and I'll make this slide deck available on my website for anybody that's interested. 3 primary factors, including the price and availability of housing, that are beyond the control of our local efforts. Whatcom County's unique geology, accelerating population growth, and mortgage interest rates. Oh, you moved too far. Okay, we're caught up. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, guys. All right, next slide. Okay. Yeah, our home here in Whatcom County really is one of the most beautiful places in the country. I think a lot of us acknowledge that. In Whatcom County, we're really blessed to have productive agricultural lands, commercial timberlands, and mature forests, and an abundance of waterways and wetlands that serve diverse ecological functions. These invaluable natural resources constitute pretty significant constraints on our human needs of habitat, housing. And these areas are going to affect the amount of growth that is available to us in the unincorporated areas of Whatcom County. And as a consequence of that, Bellingham's going to need to assume more of the development potential in the future. Next slide. Until recently, Bellingham has had a really remarkably consistent growth rate, but that trend is accelerating. And due to the increased preference of workers and their access to remote work, our quality of life and the natural beauty that we have, and also refugees that are coming here from less hospitable climates, we can and need to expect the population growth trend to continue. Next slide, Jane. Thanks. Housing is becoming an increasingly leveraged investment, and mortgage interest rates have a significant impact on housing affordability. What I wanted to illustrate with this slide is the relationship between the 30-year mortgage and the 10-year Treasury note, which is influenced by a wide range of economic conditions that are outside of what we hear about with the federal funds rate. And due to high levels of government debt, current geopolitical risk, and economic uncertainty, we should prepare for mortgage rates to potentially be higher for longer. Next slide. So now that we've analyzed a few of the factors that are impacting the housing market that are outside of our local control, in the second part of my presentation, I'd like to review some past policy actions that have impacted the development potential of our buildable lands. Thanks. Okay, this is a policy timeline that highlights some key events of the past couple decades, starting with the 1990 Growth Management Act, which required fast-growing cities to preserve open space and adopt anti-sprawl zoning and development regulations. In compliance with Growth Management Act mandates, in 2003, the Bellingham City Council prohibited the extension of municipal services outside of the city limits, which significantly reduced the development potential in our urban growth areas. In an effort to better accommodate the growth inside of the city limits, city planners in 2009 proposed the Infill Toolkit, which was designed to allow a diversity of housing forms, including townhomes, cottage homes, and duplexes in all areas of the city. But when the Infill Toolkit was ultimately adopted, its use was restricted to multifamily zones only, which had a significant reduction in the infill potential within our city. Resistance to larger developments on vacant land inside of the city limits in favor of open space and forest preservation has also resulted in the reduction of our buildable lands. From 2010 to 2018, as those are the years I served on the Planning Commission, we held hearings on multiple plats, rezones, and other land use actions that received public opposition. As a result, in 2016, during our last comprehensive plan update, the Planning Commission took a real close look at the buildable lands inventory and concluded that we needed to add areas to our urban growth. And despite a 7-0 unanimous vote to expand the UGA, the City Council decided to reject that recommendation and concluding that the current growth boundaries could accommodate the future growth. From the time that decision was made in 2016 to our current time, we've just seen a demand for housing increase, and particularly non-apartment housing. And the development potential of our lands going down and the demand going up. Next slide. For the third part of my talk, I'd like to suggest a few policy recommendations for us to consider. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the scope of the challenges that are before us. Homeownership is unaffordable for 84% of Washington families. Washington State is now the third most expensive housing market in the United States. And Whatcom County, which is largely influenced by Bellingham home prices, is the fifth most expensive housing market in Washington. Last month, in March, the median sale price of a home in Bellingham was $627,000. So, looking at these rather gloomy statistics and considering the question, where do we go from here? It reminds me of an old Irish joke about a traveler who's lost in the winding lanes of Ireland, and he sees a farmer in his field and he asks him, "Hey, how do I get to Dublin?" And the old farmer looks at him and says, "I don't know, but if I were you, I wouldn't be starting from here." I like that one. But in all seriousness, we have challenges ahead of us, but there is a reason for hope. And these are just 4 policy suggestions that I think are worthy of our consideration. That we expand our urban growth area, incentivize condominium development in the urban core, and promote townhome development, and also increase funding for transportation alternatives. Next slide, June. The city currently has an annexation phasing plan, and I would suggest that we proceed with annexing areas near the airport, and when we do, requiring minimum densities to ensure that those areas have adequate levels of housing built in the future. In my opinion, the urban growth area boundaries that we have, they need to be reorganized. Currently, our UGA includes 2 areas in the Lake Whatcom and Lake Padden watersheds that are really, in my view, inappropriate for high-intensity development and should be removed from the UGA. We should study areas to the north and the east and supplement our UGA with lands that can support the highest yield of housing with a minimum impact to watersheds and forested areas. Next slide, thanks. The rapid increase in housing prices has really impacted our modest and moderate income households the most by limiting their ability to acquire a starter home. Condominiums are an important housing type that could provide opportunities for first-time home buyers that are more affordable, and we really have an undersupply of condominiums in our housing stock. And now there's numerous barriers that constrain this housing type, which I think gives policymakers a really excellent opportunity to come up with a suite of incentives to encourage condominium development and help overcome the barriers that currently exist. Next slide. Townhomes. Townhomes are a housing form that my company's had a lot of success with building and integrating into existing neighborhoods at a moderate density and with a high level of architectural character. This is also a housing type that is very desirable for buyers due to the fee simple ownership, lower insurance premiums, and the lack of a homeowner association that usually accompanies condominiums. I think with a little creativity and some vision and community input, we could identify appropriate townhome corridors that are located on high-frequency transit routes that are in close proximity to parks and schools, and also have city blocks that have alley access for ingress and parking off the alleys. And after we identify these corridors, we should allow for reduced front yard setbacks and greater lot coverage. And I really think we'd be well served to implement policies that encourage this beautiful and traditional housing form. Lastly, I believe that we need to further our investments in transit alternatives in our city. Transportation is the second highest cost for people, second to housing. And if we could keep promoting ways for people to be less auto dependent and have more options, that would go a long way in reducing the burden of Bellingham's housing cost. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments and also for the personal experience in construction and building design that you've been bringing forward for some time. At this point, I'd like to introduce the second panelist, who is Chris Behe, who I've introduced already, the juggernaut of data knowledge in the city, who is going to present us some information about a number of things in terms of housing demand, the urban growth area, and the densities we now have versus what we'll need to be doing. So, Chris, please.
I like to stand because I have to point at stuff as I'm showing some of these things. So, good afternoon, and thank you again for having us here today on this topic. I do recognize a lot of the faces from the different public sessions that we've had so far for the Bellingham Plan over the past 6 months. So it's great to see a lot of you in the room, and we hope to see all of you at our future sessions for the Bellingham Plan. And I'll, before I get started here, I'll just go through those real quick. We have a session coming up on May 15th at Squalicum High School. We're rotating between the three high schools for economic vitality, a conversation that kind of follows the housing conversation we had a couple weeks ago at Seaholm High School. And then June 4th, we'll be at Bellingham High School again, and we'll be talking about housing types and neighborhoods. And then on July 17th, we'll finish up our 6-meeting series with the How We Grow conversation, which is getting at growth alternatives. And I'll have a slide that touches on that as well. We're also doing other meetings in the community, things like this, but also we're having a special event at Western, which will be our second event up there to reach some of the college-age population. And we're having a special Spanish language event at Shuckson Middle School on May 23rd, too, to really, again, make sure that we're hearing from everybody in the community and that we have all the different perspectives of Bellingham. Let's see if I can get this. So I'm going to touch on a variety of things that kind of bring us up to the current time period, and then when I pass off to Blake, he'll be diving a little bit deeper into some of the more complex aspects of how a lot of, like what Garrett started talking about, what all kind of weave together, and then he'll finish off the topic, which I think will put us in a good spot for questions from all of you. Just a reminder, a lot of you are familiar with our current comprehensive plan and the last couple of plans that we've approved, but Bellingham's housing strategy is really anchored with the urban village concept, which are these pink areas that you see on the map. You're familiar with a lot of those, Samish Way, the downtown core, Fairhaven, Old Town, Fountain District, and then the Barclay area. And then middle scale housing, which again is getting at that infill toolkit product that Garrett was talking about. And then an important piece is also affordable subsidized housing, which you're familiar with. The voter-approved Bellingham Housing Levy, which it's now in its second iteration, and then also our affordable housing sales tax, which are two important local pieces that we pair with the federal dollars that we get to build subsidized rental units in Bellingham. So those are kind of our three main anchors. The urban village concept, we've seen, again, different urban villages. Some of them were already fully formed, like downtown when we did the downtown subarea plan, but we added additional rules and regulations that really emphasize or make sure that the pedestrian environment and the transportation connections and the way that we would provide the mix of uses in those areas will really work together to form truly vibrant places, that kind of placemaking exercise that you hear us planners talk about periodically. Since 2006, when the urban villages became part of our official kind of land use scheme, they've absorbed almost 3,000 housing units, and which is about a third of the growth that we've experienced in Bellingham over that time. And we do continue to make adjustments to these as we go forward. You're familiar with the City Council recently reduced all parking restrictions, or parking requirements rather, within the Old Town sub-area. We've done updates to the Waterfront District, and we'll be doing more next year for the Marine Trades area. The Barclay Village area is undergoing a formal planning process to bring about a formal urban village plan for that district. So we continue to nurse things along as things evolve in our community. The residential multi-code, which is where we can build multifamily housing in Bellingham, you can see we have a wide variety of areas that have that higher density designation. And in 2021, we did a significant update to that section of our development code. We went from a wide variety. We had about 60 different types of residential multi-zoning, and we simplified it to 3 flavors: low, medium, and high density, which was a big step for us. And then we also we implemented minimum densities so that we had some assurance going forward that they would perform at least at a minimum level, and that we would see less of the detached housing forms being built in these areas that have really close access to transit, that are served by the full range of utilities and urban services. And that overall increased the development capacity for the city by about 20%. So it was a significant effort for us to get to that point, but well worth it given the impact on our land supply. And again, the infill toolkit, which Garrett mentioned, that's something that it was kind of a slow burn. We adopted it in 2009, and as of the 2016 plan, we really only had 2 or 3 projects that had utilized the infill toolkit. Soon after that, things really changed, though, and we've had almost 600 housing units that have been either built or under construction now or in the approval process. And you can see that they are distributed pretty well around the city. In 2018, when we updated our land division ordinance, or Title 23, we included a provision in there where single-family zones that have a cluster provision can utilize the infill toolkit, and they actually get a 50% density bonus if half the housing forms are townhomes or other kinds of toolkit forms. It's probably hard to see, but those are the areas that are colored green on the map here. So the one thing that we'll be addressing, and Blake will talk about this a little bit, is how do we get the infill toolkit to work in these yellow areas on the map, which are the remaining parts, residential zoning, that do not currently allow that housing form. So that's part of our conversations in the coming months. So that a sense of where those forms are in town today and where they might be allowed in the future. One final thought on that too, the townhome product that Garrett mentioned, that has been far and away the dominant form that we've seen approved in infill toolkit projects. And about 3/4 of the townhomes that have been approved have been on fee lots. So they are a for sale product by and large, which is something that we really like to see. And then that kind of third leg of the stool is the affordable housing component, which has been a huge lift for the community with, again, like I mentioned, the affordable housing sales tax, but importantly, the voter approved levy. And then you probably can't see them all, but you might recognize some of the many community partners that we have, which are what really make the dollars that kind of get funneled through the city get distributed to experts in the affordable housing industry that actually build those units for us. And then importantly, help with the monitoring and upkeep and some of the wraparound services that get provided for those different facilities. Last year in 2023, it was almost $15 million, and almost half of that money went into production of affordable rental housing. The other slices of the pie are equally important. Those are those supportive wraparound services and related programs that make those housing products successful. So that's a huge puzzle there. The Buildable Lands Report was a report card that Bellingham, Whatcom County, and all of the other cities were required to do in 2022. And that was looked at the first 5 years of the current planning period that we're in. So that would have been from the 2016 comprehensive plan through 2021. We looked at that 5 years worth of development, and we did a deep dive into every single permit that each jurisdiction approved, what was the density that was achieved, how many units were produced, how many people were accommodated, and then also the same thing for employment lands. And this is just a map of all of the projects that were residential that were built in Bellingham, and actually this has been updated through 2023, so it's a 7-year snapshot instead of a 5-year. There were some big takeaways. One is that Bellingham is, from the concept of development, we're meeting our infill goals. We're exceeding the densities that we had anticipated in 2016. somewhere between, depending on if you cut it off at 2021 or 2023, we're somewhere in the 11, 12, or 13 unit per acre range for all residential projects combined, and we had anticipated being somewhere just north of 7 units per acre. So we're doing very well in that respect. We're really still falling short on the affordability piece of it, though, and I think we all know that. And so that's where we need to focus our efforts going forward. So, but you can see that we have a lot of projects in all the different parts of town there. This is a snapshot of where we count buildable land across the city, and we have a variety of types. We have kind of what you would always think of as vacant land. It could be forested or not forested. We have lands that are partially used, which could be a home with a big side yard, some additional capacity to build more housing. We have underutilized properties, which could be single-story buildings in our urban villages where you can build up to 6 stories in some cases. And then we have a variety of things like our pending projects and master plans for our different institutional campuses in town where we count and have a certain amount of development that we know is coming based on conversations with those agencies and entities. As Tim mentioned, 2023 was a landmark year for housing legislation. 2021 was also a landmark year. That's when House Bill 1220, which requires us to plan for housing for all income levels, was passed. And so combining that House Bill 1220, which largely steers our comprehensive plan update process, with things like House Bill 1110, which is that middle housing bill, allowing up to 4 units outright on every residential lot in Bellingham, and in some cases up to 6. And then you might remember House Bill 1337, which is the accessory dwelling unit bill, which our city council acted on that early. And instead of waiting till 2026, they adopted just about the requirements of House Bill 1337 last year, so now you can build 2 accessory units on any lot in Bellingham. You can build them a little bit larger and a little bit taller than before. And also the approval process has been simplified somewhat. So some progress there. One that got passed in the legislative session that just finished was House Bill 1998. I think it has been signed by the governor now, and that allows co-living or encourages co-housing kinds of arrangements. And so those are another way to get a little bit deeper into that naturally occurring affordability, where you might find a bedroom with a bathroom that's has shared kitchen and living facilities, and it might be renting for $700 to $800 instead of what we see studios, for instance, renting for, which would be in the $1,300 or $1,400 a month range. So again, some creative and different ways of getting through that affordability maze. Again, our project schedule for the Bellingham Plan, we find ourselves kind of here in phase 2. We're starting to have these community conversations about different growth approaches. You can see the graph up there that paints the picture of how much population we need to accommodate. I would agree 100% with what Garrett's. We don't see that trend changing over time, or the curve becoming any less than it is right now. And as we get into the fall, we'll be talking about these things in more detail with our commission, with the community, honing in on what would become our preferred growth alternative. These are just some thumbnail graphics of some of the growth approaches that we're considering. If you've been to some of our public sessions for the Bellingham Plan, you might have seen these, and they include everything from continuing to focus on existing urban villages and allowing House Bill 1110 to play out around the city, to focusing on more corridor-style development. Some of like the townhomes on high-frequency transit corridors would play well into that scenario. We're also looking at the alternatives that would include boundary expansion, so kind of messing with our urban boundary and bringing more area in for development. So all of those things are on the table. They're all part of the different growth alternatives we're talking with all of you in the community about. They'll also be part of the countywide environmental impact analysis, and so we'll be weighing and balancing how all these different alternatives play with affordability levels, with housing supply in general, with our climate action goals, and with transportation and things like forest canopy preservation. So all of those things will swirl in together, and it's a lot to balance, and we absolutely need all of you at the table to help with those conversations. I'll finish leaving it here with our development dashboard. If you haven't seen this, I would encourage you, when you're not on your phone, but at a bigger screen like your home computer, pull up the cov.org/dev dashboard. It's a live view of development in Bellingham. It gets updated every night from our permit center. And the big takeaway here is you can see these numbers on the left side of the screen. In the last 6 months, we've finished about 600, a little more than 600 housing units. We've got about almost 670 under construction right now, and a big uptick recently of almost 1,000 units that are in application. So a lot is coming. And with that, I'll hand it off to Blake, and he'll give you a little bit deeper dive on some of these topics.
Chris, thanks you very much. That's extremely informative. And at this moment, I'm sorry, Blake, if I may, just a moment. I do need to introduce Mayor Kim Lund, who has joined us today, and we're delighted to have her here with us. I hope you are still here, Kim. Would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you for what you've taken on. Because in the end, all of the credit will go to you and any blame that's there too. You know, I know what it's like as a mayor. Okay, Blake.
All right, great. No pressure. The boss is in the room. So thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. I have what could be stretched out into an hour or 2 hour long conversation that I'm going to try to get through in about 15 minutes. But with that, and having said that, there's really 3 takeaways that I hope you'll leave with today. And the first one is this.
Blake, can you use the mic,
Yeah.
please? Thank you.
This is my tagline. This is something that we've talked about a lot in our department. And the idea is simply kind of the play on words, housing for the sum of us, meaning all of us as a community. What does it take when we think about that range of providing those housing supply opportunities for all of us in this community, not those of us just that are here today, but those that may come in the future, and not just for some of us. And so really, I hope that you'll kind of think about this context as we get into kind of these other materials that we go through. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this. We know that housing prices across the country have begun to rise. It's not just ownership. You also see the increased rates in rental prices. The reality is, and the takeaway from this, is that median home prices, whether they're ownership or rental, are far outpacing our income stream. And so we see more and more households that are cost burdened. When we look at those growth projections of where we've been, this is a chart that goes from 1980 to last year, we see a consistent and continual rise in this community. Even at our greatest point in time when we had the most recent economic downturn, that population trend still continued to grow in this community. We see the challenges and look back at the housing production and where that's occurred over that same time frame. Actually, I should say from 2000 to current day. And we're still feeling the effects of that economic downturn that we had, that 5-year span that runs through this. And so as we begin to think about how that translates and we look forward into the future and where the state's giving us, we have to look at kind of the makeup of what our community is. This graphic represents all the areas in this kind of goldenrod yellow color are the areas where we have detached single-family homes and single-family homes. And the majority of our land uses in this community are dedicated to this piece. And so how is it that we can use that term kind of gentle density where we're looking at and reevaluating and leveraging the investment that we as a community have already made in these particular areas without completely upsetting and dealing with this?
Mike,
Yeah.
could you make sure to keep the mic?
Swallow it, huh? Okay. House Bill 12. Now, this is not for you to try to pour over the details of this. It's simply just to show you that this is the first time in the state's history that we are now looking at a per county basis on what that means. We've set targets, we set specific targets that we're trying to work through. So this is Whatcom County as we look towards 2024, 2025 timeframe, so that kind of 20-year horizon. What are the different numbers and targets that we need to hit? And it's the first time in the state's history where we've started to do that and break it down by income level and try to look at what we need as a community. Now, this is, again, countywide. When we start doing the analysis, and I'm not going to take time to go through all of this, but we start to look at it at a per year basis, we really need to be at this kind of 825 number. When you look at that graphically, going back to this chart I showed you earlier, that's where we need to be. The 5-year study that Chris was talking about, we're typically around 644. So we're not currently at where that target needs to be. I'll come back to this a little bit, and we talk about how do we bump that number up continually, and how do we begin to address that over those income ranges. Now, this one I'm going to linger on a little bit longer. I showed you this in a minute. So what you may notice in all of this is that 63% of that total number is at the lower end. This is 80% and below is where you get the subsidized units. That's what we consider the capital A affordable. PSH is permanent supportive housing. It means that somebody does not have the ability to live on their own. They need some assistance in that area. Okay? When you take that same dynamic and you start to put different levels of affordability, the yellow is somebody that's low income, orange is very low, and red is extremely low income. And this is what often gets labeled as workforce housing. Okay, so we start to begin to think about where those numbers are. When you take the area median income adjusted for a household size of 4 individuals, you need to be making $97,300 to get to that 100% of AMI. Okay, these are the different incomes that are then kind of the top end of those respective ranges. The challenge and the thing that we're facing in this community, and we touched on it with my fellow colleagues up here, is that the median home price in Bellingham is that you need to be making 181% of that income to be able to afford the median home price. So you need to be making, on average, the household about $176,000 a year to be able to do that. That's when we talked about where only 84% of Washingtonians can't afford. This is what we're talking about. The gap between here and here is the challenge. Okay. All right. The second thing I really hope you'll take away from this is that housing is a continuum. We need to talk about housing all the way from the left side of the spectrum, or those that are unhoused currently, all the way through to market rate home ownership. And that whole continuum is the sum SUM. That's all of us. Okay. I use this term, it's from a book, I didn't come up with it, but the 3 S's, supply, stability, and subsidy. I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through this. Chris touched on this a little bit. There are a range of programs that get at funding those things. We've got different shelters that we're providing. If you haven't seen it, the new Lighthouse mission on Holly is getting closer to completing construction. We've got tiny home villages at several different locations across the city. We know we do about a little more than 300 motel and hotel stays for folks that are in transitional housing needs a year. One of the challenges here is that on average, those hotel and motel stays, think about somebody fleeing maybe a domestic violence situation or something like that. Those used to be average about 3 to 4 month stays. Because of the current economic climate we're in, those are now going to about 12 months on average. So that means that's about a third of the people that we can support, and so there's more funding, more needs that are there. We get into different needs in federal programs like housing vouchers and permanently affordable, and so we see projects like this that are going up where we need affordable rentals. This is the new Mercy housing project that's down in Millworks on the waterfront area that's coming online. One of the cool things about this is an 83 unit affordable housing project that 15 of those units are available to people that are homeless upon entry. So again, thinking about that full continuum and how we're meeting everybody's needs in doing that. We even have partners that are out there in the community that are trying to get affordable home ownerships, whether that's Colston Community Land Trust. There's others that are out in that space as well, but trying to create that. And Chris touched on spreading those around the community and trying to get those accesses so it makes those options available to the greatest extent. We've got a variety of different funding sources, but the need right now, we spend about $15 million annually to do this. We're probably about 10% of what we need, just to kind of give you an idea of where that is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but we're producing on average about 130 affordable housing units a year over the recent time frame. We really need to be at 520. So you saw these numbers. This 825 is made up of this 520. This is that 63% that I showed you earlier. That's what that means, okay? Now, I'm not going to touch on this in any greater detail. Chris touched on it a little bit. We've got development patterns that are urban villages, infill toolkits, greenfield developments. So we're going to skip through some of this rather quickly. But I do want to take a minute to hone in on a few of the pieces like we talked about. Those. Let me go back one slide. Those areas, those yellow areas, how do we begin to utilize the existing networks there? We've got roadway, sewer, water infrastructure that's already there. How do we, open up some of the yield that's within those existing contexts? How do we allow those people that might be living in a 4-bedroom house, but they're a single individual, to open up some capacity in there? Or maybe they have a bigger yard, or maybe they want to keep that, we talk a little bit about aging in place. That doesn't always necessarily mean staying in the same building that you've lived in for a long, but it may mean staying in the same community, having the same networks, being able to go back, to the same doctor that you've been to for the last 25 years, the same set of family members and community members that you've grown accustomed to. So how do we untap some of that yield? Accessory dwelling units is one thing. The state has provided, and Chris mentioned that, there's a lot of resources out there that get at trying to provide this option, whether it's the aging child that's coming home, whether that's an elderly parent that's coming in, whether that's just somebody that needs something more natural, affordable, and being able to move into those spaces. The state law, and as Chris mentioned, we adopted a lot of this. I want to hone in on a couple things. There's now, under the state law, we haven't fully adopted this yet, but there will not be an owner occupancy requirement. There's now 2 ADUs that are allowed per lot, and the square footage has increased up to 1,000 square feet per unit. So it's a very, I grew up and lived in a house that was 960 square feet, and that was the starter home. Kind of gotten away from that, but the ADUs really can represent that in a bigger way. So there's a variety of different ways and accommodations that you can begin to look at that. The blue and the green on the left here are different examples and configurations. We're also working with the building code to make sure we understand what that means and how we work through some of the challenges or limitations that might be there, so we can make those as affordable as appropriate or as possible. There's existing examples throughout our community that don't have to be offensive, that can be in scale or in keeping with architecture in that. And then we want to talk about the middle housing piece a little bit. We in this country have done really well at building the single family. We've done pretty well at building the bigger multifamily. The gap is where we're talking about. So this is the kind of photos examples. If you're the type of data file that you like to get into looking at this, the green represents those single family, the purple represents the bigger apartment buildings, and this is the space that we are highly underutilized. So we talk about this. This is another popular graphic that's out there and looking at kind of those different ranges. The state law allows for a wide range of different housing types. In fact, what it does is it establishes that under the state law, there are 9 different types that are approved under the state law. We are considered a tier 1 city where we have a population of over 75,000. We are required to provide at least 6 out of those 9 available anywhere. It doesn't have to be the same 6 in every location. So that's one of the things that we're talking about. We can allow for examples like multi-generational houses where you have, grandma living in one wing, boomerang child coming back through that. We've got existing infill toolkit that provides a lot of that stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the sense that we really need to get, and this is the third thing, it's about providing options for people, right? It's about looking at things at where they are in life and how do we give them the greatest extent, the greatest opportunity to be able to look at some of these things and go through the range. And we can look at existing neighborhoods and we can say, okay, there's a house scale that fits well within those existing neighborhoods, and we can design those kind of 6 out of 9 we talked about in there. And then there are some that are maybe a little bit bigger on a block scale, and we can do some of these things. So we're working through those different dynamics to make sure that we can kind of right size, but again, open up those options and opportunities. So in my last comments, housing for the sum of us, not just for some of us, okay? Second is thinking about housing in a continuum. And lastly, more options, integrating and leveraging the existing investments that we've made in our neighborhoods and our community already. So if we can do those three things, I think we'll be trending in the right direction. So thank you for your time and for your questions.
Blake, thank you very much for that. We're going to be opening now for questions and answers, questions from the audience. But first, if I may, Blake, could I ask you please to address one thing that I think we haven't talked about? Many of our neighborhoods, particularly starting in the 50s, have in place protective covenants and restrictions that are written into the subdivisions. How much is that going to affect our ability to shoulder throughout the community the need for housing development?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So I'm going to answer it maybe a little broader than the way it was asked, but the state law, we have until 6 months after the comprehensive plan to enact that state law, the middle housing requirement. So that will take us to middle of 2026. And if we do not take local action on it, then the state law and the model ordinance that's being developed by the Department of Commerce supersedes our local regulations. So we have to take action in order to implement that. There are several, what I'll refer to as carve-outs, and it gets to what your question is, Tim, that says, okay, it's not a one-size-fits-all everywhere. There's an opportunity to look at it. There are places like in the legislation, we pulled out Lake Whatcom watershed because that's our drinking water supply. There are other critical areas where that's not applicable. There may be other areas where there's not existing utilities servicing those areas. And one of the other pieces that does not extend into the new state law is where there are existing CC&Rs, covenants, restrictions that go into those neighborhoods. The state law does prohibit new development applications from putting in those exclusions, but it does not eradicate those exclusions that exist already. So there are existing neighborhoods within the city that have the covenants that you're speaking of that will not be subject to the infill, the middle housing regulations, unless they choose as a neighborhood to amend their bylaws and regulations.
Okay, thanks so much. Now, Garrett, do you have anything that you want to add real quickly here, or Chris? How are we doing? Okay, all right. So we're going to take questions from the audience. We have traveling Mike that will come around. So if you would raise your hand, please. We would appreciate if you would just introduce yourself just by name when you have the mic in front of you. And again, we're looking for questions, not long statements. So.
Thank you all very much for a great presentation. I wish you had an hour more. I would like you to address one part of the equation that does not directly involve housing, transportation. Our single-family neighborhoods were built with the understanding we'd all have one or maybe two cars, and we drive to wherever we go. Urban villages are nice, still require a car. How is the city and the county, for that matter, going to work to provide better transportation?
I think the start of the response to that question comes into leveraging the partnerships that exist already. So working with WTA, working with other maybe micro-mobility options that exist. The other part of that is it's a bit of a chicken and egg conversation in terms of what comes first and how we plan for that. But one of the things that we've been talking about internally at the city is how do we look at where those existing routes are? Where can we leverage them? This is where that kind of 9 approved middle housing units that exist, may be more applicable to have some of the larger scales closer in proximity to those transit corridors, where that bigger scale or that bigger form may not be as entirely appropriate within the existing neighborhoods. So looking at those details, Chris and his team have done quite a bit to look at those existing transit routes, think about where the walkability is to those transit routes, where it's a quarter mile or maybe a half mile. We've done some of those different plannings, so there might be different yields as you get closer. It helps and gives that housing component to be closer to that proximity where maybe, and I don't want to say that it's an eradication of parking that is there, but it gives people that option to gives people that option to not rely on or demand a parking space. So we have, giving some consideration in that respect.
Next question. Why don't you introduce yourself too, Mary Lou?
I'm Mary Lou Stewart. I'm the mayor of Blaine and into parking. This has been our biggest problem in the downtown area. Can I just ask you, in your downtown area, what are the parking requirements for a studio, a one-bedroom, and a two-bedroom?
I will have to go off of memory a little bit. We have a parking exemption area that is a portion of downtown, so there are no requirements. We've actually extended that same requirement into Old Town, so there are some areas, kind of subsets within those urban villages and cores where there is no additional requirements. And thinking back on some of the studios, I believe were a 0.75 space and 0.5 depending on the mix. And so it changes a little bit depending on the unit type. I can get you more detailed information, but part of what we're evaluating and part of what our city council will be considering in the upcoming months is whether or not those parking minimums are really inhibitors to getting additional housing. And so one of the questions is, do we take a step back or rethink how those parking minimums are required?
Yeah, my name's Doug Carlberg, and I've been very concerned about this housing. There's a law on the books, the Growth Management Act, that requires that there is a plan for all economic groups. And although the statistics that the middle gentleman put up on the board he called dismal, those weren't dismal. After 25 years, that was an absolute failure to comply with the statute. I'll get to the question. I'm sorry about that. So here's my question. The city and the county and the port all have eminent domain powers. The Supreme Court has said that they can go out and purchase agricultural land at $35,000 an acre, pay for it, and put in mobile homes. I'm watching all of these solutions up here, and I'm wondering why any of those solutions are less affordable than mobile homes, which are the cheapest homes in America. And I don't see you guys mentioning it for 1 second, and yet the problem is affordability.
So let's give him a second to mention that. Respond.
Actually, no, here, it's on. Thank you for that. The city did recognize the naturally affordable piece of our housing pie that manufactured housing represents. And so starting in 2019, and then the code was adopted in late 2022, we adopted the Manufactured Housing Park Overlay Zone, which protects the 10 parks in Bellingham, somewhere around 900 housing units there. And then and provides for a limited range of uses within those parks, the main goal being to preserve them as manufactured housing. And then within the other places within our development code, in the event that a manufactured housing park goes through the hearing examiner process and is exempted out of that, there are additional closure notifications and compensation to residents that need to happen in compliance with state law. So we do recognize that. We don't, and our code does allow for new manufactured housing to be built currently just in our residential multi-plan zones. So there is a provision for that. And we do recognize it as, like I said, a naturally affordable housing form.
One thing I'll add to that is one of the things that we've been looking at is the limitations or restrictions that are represented in the building code and trying to match some of those requirements up with the local zoning. So one of the challenges is, like, for example, when you have parkland model homes, which are a form of manufactured homes, they have different insulation requirements. They have different, code provisions that are in there. So how do we get some of these regulatory frameworks to line up a little bit more effectively so that those become more viable options and that we can get a broader range of tiny homes, mobile homes, park models, different other things like that, so that the menu of options is broader. And so if we can get those pieces, then I think it speaks a little bit more to where you're going, is where we can look at a range of those different things. When you're talking about like ADUs or other options that are in communities, it's still pretty expensive to build an ADU. I mean, I'm hearing examples where it's $300, $400, $500 a square foot. And so your ADUs are still costing anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000. So how do you get that price point? Maybe a manufactured home, maybe cut that in half, or get some. So lining up some of those regulatory pieces is a big component.
But, a manufactured home is $50 to $75 a square foot, and I'm sitting here going, we're talking about affordability. Why are we not putting that up front and center? Because it's affordable.
We've been working with local builders to try to do that. One of the examples is the Favor Construction, where they build in their, and so there's definitely.
All right, other questions that we can? Yeah. Here, I'm just gonna. Hello? Oh, there we go.
I'm Eric Hurst. Thanks for 3 really great, well-informed, data-driven talks. Really appreciate that. All of you assume that population is an exogenous factor. It's external. We can't control it. To what extent can we in the city of Bellingham and Whatcom County actually manage future population growth, either depending on our perspectives and preferences, raise it or lower it from what the state's Office of Financial Management suggests?
I could speak to that a little bit. I guess the short answer, which you may not like, is we really can't. And the risk we run if we artificially lower that number is that we will underplan our infrastructure, and then we'll be in a real bind when the people that the state forecast would move here when they do, and then we find that our roads and our utilities are even more deficient than maybe they are today. So we absolutely don't want to find ourselves in that situation, which is a big part of what growth management does, is that concurrency planning. It requires us to plan for what we think is going to happen. So that's the short answer. I will say, and I've heard it said in recent meetings that people wish OFM was involved with the stock market, but they have been very accurate with their median projections over the past 20 years. So there's no reason to expect that the current numbers that they're putting out for the 20-year forecast would be dramatically different. If anything, we're anticipating, because of some of the climate refugee and other kinds of things that people have mentioned here, and remote work, which is another important component where people are able to move here and keep their jobs elsewhere, that the number could even be higher than what's been anticipated in the past.
I'm going to comment on that too. Eric, I got a thought on one thing. The department, you mentioned the Department of Commerce requires us to plan for certain growth projections. I think one of the things, the assumptions that we need to challenge is, are we even current right now? Because we've been behind in planning for growth for, I believe, 20 years. So those growth projections that we're looking forward to meet for the next 20, it's where do we start from? We're starting from a deficit, and I think we need to acknowledge that.
I'll offer one comment in response to that. When you look at state of California, and there's a lot of things that are different there than here, and I want to acknowledge that, but they had a similar project. They've been doing these housing allocations for decades. And so when I used to work there, one of the challenges, if you don't plan for that infrastructure, if you don't plan for that growth accommodation, then in California, they developed a tool called the Builder's Remedy. Which means that if you don't provide the housing allocation numbers, then a developer can come in and say, here you go, I'll do it for you. And local governments are required to approve projects. And so if you want to have some ability to manage, to plan, to think about that kind of stuff, then you need to be proactive and have a seat at the table. Because if you don't, somebody else will.
Hello. John Lesso from Vancouver, British Columbia. One thing you didn't touch on very much was the quality of life for young children growing up within city limits, something I'm sure a lot of you have enjoyed. We have the same legislation in British Columbia as you do in Washington, elimination of all single-family zones. How is that going to benefit the quality of life for young children growing up in Bellingham or Vancouver or anywhere else in these states when, we all have enjoyed that? And my final question too is, what is your current level of salary? Each one of you, starting with Blake. It's a valid question.
It's a matter of public record. So it is a matter of public record.
What is it?
Mine is, the last I checked, I think 190.
Okay. US.
Yes.
130?
Mine varies year to year, depending on a number of factors, so.
He's a private, he's not a public employee.
I'm a home builder, so naturally not for profit.
So if I may add, in response to the children question, so I have 3 children myself. And one of the things in being a local or a recent transplant to the city of Bellingham that I particularly value is walkability. And I chose to reside in a community, in a neighborhood where my 7-year-old can walk to school. I have a lot of privilege. I have the benefit of a salary that affords me that, to your point. It shouldn't be exclusive to just me. In my opinion, having better routes, safe routes to school, more accommodations, giving the same advantages that my children have to be able to walk to their respective school. So I've got an elementary school student who walks. I've got a middle school student who takes public transportation, WTA, to the middle school, and a high schooler that rides their bike. That option, that ability, in my opinion, when you get those densities, when you get some of those things, gets afforded to more people. And that's the goal in this, is to provide people options and opportunities abroad, regardless of where you are. It shouldn't be just for an elite position or somebody who's been privileged enough to be in that role. It should be.
960 square feet where you grew up, was that ground level and was that a yard?
You've had many opportunities, please.
We have a lot of folks with questions.
We have a lot of people with questions, so please sit down if you can, and let's give
Next
other
question.
people an opportunity, please.
We're going to move to some.
I get a real quick comment on that. I think it's important in Bellingham that we recognize the areas that we've done a really good job. We have excellent parks and trails, and the level of service that we have and the access that we have in our town is really a first-class asset. And we have room to build within these areas and give people access to that open space. So we should be proud of that.
I think one parting thought just on that, and then I'll let it go. But the approach that we're taking in the Bellingham plan when we talk about these things is that the middle housing component in particular, and a lot of them are ownership oriented, single level. You have people you might be sharing a wall with, but not above or below you. They are a means to provide an improvement in quality of life in our existing neighborhoods, because we will have that density that will support even more parks, even more trails, even more multimodal pedestrian bike facilities within our existing neighborhoods that are relatively low density today, where those facilities cannot be supported at the level of density there. So it could be a win-win for neighborhoods, more places for people, more options, and an improved quality of life by having those amenities within an easy walk of where you live and have embedded neighborhood services. So that's the conversation we're having with the community is how do we make it come out as a win-win for the entire community?
Hello, my name is Mary Anderson and I work for WTA. And question for Garrett. So WTA has lots of meetings with the cities and other local jurisdictions. How can we be a better partner to developers to help with the Bellingham's housing dilemma?
That's a great question. I think looking at the high frequency routes and aligning those with the planning efforts so that you guys are looking at your levels of service, where you're going to have those go routes, those 15-minute routes, and that they're aligned on corridors where we're going to see higher levels of density. I also think there's a big conversation in our community right now about parking and whether or not we should be giving parking waivers to higher intensity development. And I'm less inclined to be giving parking waivers away. I think that we should give developers an opportunity to pay a fee in lieu of, so they can pay down their parking requirements and offset and mitigate that impact by helping fund transportation. So those are a couple ideas.
I think I think this extends both to WTA and to WashDOT and some other areas. There's opportunities to look at the physical land and the assets that those agencies own and build in some kind of housing. I know the model is a transit service agency, but for example, and there's conversations happening about the downtown station. It's a fairly low scale station. And so how do we think about those air rights above that and potential about getting additional housing opportunities and utilizing that space so that there's a support, and whether there's opportunities and options to build in some units that maybe fund drivers, maintenance folks, other folks that might be affiliated with the organizations that maybe would be better served to be closer to work and to do those kinds of things. So looking at those land assets in not just transit service ways, but how can they be multidisciplined in that respect as well?
Hi, my name is Shenandoah Myrick, and my question is, how are we going to avoid the unintended consequences that we will get from these additional densities that cannot be financed by your typical homeowner? We're going to end up with developers who are creating these infills of 4 units or even 2 ADUs, and then they're going to be market value units, and we're still not going to have affordable housing.
You make a good point in that, and it's probably fair to say, but for those that are the subsidized units, most new construction is coming in at the higher end of the market. So there is some ability to say, okay, if we provide some supply there, then there's some natural attrition that opens up other existing homes to take on a different position. But part of what we're trying to do at the city is, if I could answer how to avoid all unintended consequences, I probably would be doing something different, but yeah, or we wouldn't be having this discussion. But being intentional, being mindful, being data-driven, tracking these things, looking at performance measures, as a profession, we have a challenge in that we oftentimes are very additive and we just add more and more regulations. Some of those things is going back in and evaluating, are we getting the desired outcomes from this piece? Can we tweak it? Can we adjust it? Are there ways? Chris talked about the RM zoning where we streamline certain things. So it's being thoughtful, it's being intentional, it's engaging people with the lived experiences like you all in this room or those that are attending the Bellingham plan, and being able to understand, are we getting what we intended? And if not, having those critical conversations about where we can adjust, where we can tweak it, and making them lived plans. I'll give you one example, and this is part of where Garrett's comment is about the parking. The last time we substantially adjusted the parking regulations in the city of Bellingham, anybody want to venture a guess? 1969. So we adopted our first zoning code in 1947. There were 3 parking regulations at that time. We adjusted it in 50 and then again in 54, and we added a 4th one. And then we substantially changed it in 1969, and we haven't made any major changes. There's been some little tweaks and stuff, but are we getting what we intended? And so that ability to have that feedback loop and do that kind of stuff is becoming critically important. You're never going to avoid all unintended consequences, but shortening that gap from how you can address them and how you can fix them is really where I think the value is.
I have something to add on that. You know, as a builder, it is difficult to meet that affordable housing just because of the cost of construction. And it's not unique to building for profit. Also, if you look at some of our home fund funded projects, like the Millworks project that was recently completed at the waterfront, I think that was 83 units and at a cost of $37 million. So, I mean, that's something like $450. Yeah, so $460,000 a unit. So, I mean, from an affordability standpoint, I think we really need to kind of step back and look at where we're spending our valuable resources, because our home fund is limited, and maybe we'd be better for subsidies and rent vouchers to help people just make up that extra $500 that they might need to be able to afford something. That's why I also in my presentation talked about condominiums as an important housing form, and looking if we're going to subsidize and use public money, how can we do that in order to get the housing types that are more affordable, because those can be.
I just wanted to ask a question. This is the boss asking the question here. I appreciate this presentation and that it was so data-driven, but I also want to bring us back to the humanity as we endeavor to create more affordable housing. The question that came from the gentleman is, how does smaller spaces benefit children? And housing affordability, if you aren't as income constrained, you have more experiences as a parent to create opportunities through arts or music lessons or playing on a sports team. You get to complete the fullness of the human experience for your child. For seniors, it might be meaning that you can afford a medication and not be stretching. If you're a single worker, housing affordability means that you're able to afford a car repair that would otherwise prevent you from, going to regular employment. And so I'm wondering how that feedback and that humanity piece has shown up in the Bellingham plan so far, and how the community is providing that feedback to us right now.
Thank you for that. We've heard a lot, and especially in our community vision survey that we put out last year, we mailed out to 40,000 households and heard back from about 5,000. It was an incredible response. And the general term we've been operating on that our planning team is looking at folding into the comp plan update, the Bellingham plan, is community well-being. And it's a multifaceted topic. It deals with a lot of things. A big part of it is, one, reaching folks in the community that we traditionally have not heard from. So not wealthy homeowners, but the renters, the BIPOC population, our students, and the people with disabilities. There's a very long list of folks that we traditionally have not heard from in our public planning processes. And so that's part of it. The other part is just the way that the full range of not just city provided, but just services in general in our community are provided and are or not accessible to a variety of folks. And some of that's transportation, some of it's time that things are accessible. So all of those things together kind of come together, and a big part of what we heard in our phase one was around safety, and trying to hear that people are, not just kind of traditional public safety kinds of topics or transportation safety, but just, do I feel welcome in this community? And do I feel like I have an even chance with the other folks in my community? And all of that, it's a very complicated, very organic, potentially subjective topic, but it is something that we need to address in the plan. We've heard loud and clear from a wide variety of community members at every single session that these topics are front and center for people. And so we will be pondering, how do we address that? What are policies that the city of Bellingham can have that are actionable, that could deal with these topics? And a lot of it will be partnering with our community partners that deal, in some respects, a lot more in that realm in providing services. But absolutely, a great point, and it is something we're hearing a lot about.
Okay, well, guess what, folks? we have run out of time.
Tim, I got to cheat. I got one question that's about data. Mark Osmondson, the chart about the percentage of people that were not able, that fell below the point where housing is just not affordable given the current prices. What percentage of our population can afford a median priced house in Bellingham?
Close to about 20.
Yeah, about a third would have a chance, but there's also the supply issue. So it's complicated would be the answer. But yeah, it's certainly not the majority, nowhere near half.
So Mark, we have many previous mayors to thank for us for how we've gotten to this point. Thank you so much for raising the question. Really, we have to wrap up. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking three excellent presenters. And thank you all for coming today. Hopefully our panelists will be able to stick around for a bit in case you have questions you want to come forward and ask them individually.